one day somebody does something unspeakable to someone else, to someone you hardly knew, and you do something about it because you can.
This story comes to us from The Guardian. Some wear baklavas, some wear neck gaiters, sunglasses, hats. Some wear masks and casual clothes like street clothes. Across the country, armed federal immigration officers have increasingly hidden their identities while carrying out immigration raids, arresting protesters, and roughing up prominent Democratic critics. It's a trend that has sparked alarm among civil rights and law enforcement experts alike. Mike German, a former FBI agent, said officers' widespread use of masks was unprecedented in U.S. law enforcement and a sign of a rapidly eroding democracy. He said masking symbolizes the drift of law enforcement away from democratic controls. The Department of Homeland Security has insisted masks are necessary to protect officers' privacy, arguing without providing evidence that there has been an uptick in violence against agents. But German argued the long term consequences could be severe. The practice could erode trust in U.S. law enforcement agencies. It already has. When it's hard to tell who a masked individual is working for, it's hard to accept that that is a legitimate use of authority, German noted. And he said, when real agents use masks more frequently, it becomes easier for imposters to operate. German, who previously worked undercover in white supremacist and militia groups and is now a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, that's a nonprofit group, spoke to The Guardian about the dangers of officer masking, why he thinks officers are concealing themselves, and how far the United States has deviated from democratic norms. This conversation is edited and condensed, but this is the interview. Were you surprised by the frequent reports of federal officers covering their faces and refusing to identify themselves, especially during the recent immigration raids and protests in Los Angeles? He responds, it is absolutely shocking and frightening to see masked agents who are poorly identified in the way they are dressed, using force in public without clearly identifying themselves. Our country is known for having democratic control over law enforcement. When it's hard to tell who a masked individual is working for, it's hard to accept that that is a legitimate use of authority. It's particularly important for officers to identify themselves when they're making arrests. It's important for the person being arrested and for community members who might be watching that they understand this is a law enforcement activity. Question: is there any precedent in the U.S. for this kind of widespread law enforcement masking? He answers, I'm not aware of any period where U.S. law enforcement officials wore masks other than the Lone Ranger. And masking has always been associated with police states. I think the masking symbolizes the drift of law enforcement away from democratic controls. We see this during protests. We see this in ICE raids. And we see this in the excessive secrecy in which law enforcement has increasingly operated since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Question: how does masking fit into the post 9/11 trends in American policing? He responds, after 9/11, there were significant changes to the law. The Patriot Act expansion of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, changes to FBI guidelines that allowed mass warrantless surveillance. Those changes rolled back reforms that had been put in place to address law enforcement abuses, including the targeting of disfavored political activists. As the federal government greatly expanded its authorities, state and local law enforcement adopted a similar approach they called intelligence-led policing. That included the creation of fusion centers in which state, local, and federal law enforcement share information with each other and private sector entities. Roughly 80 fusion centers exist today, and there is very little oversight and regulation. and they operate under a thick cloak of secrecy, often targeting disfavored protest groups. Once police think of themselves as domestic intelligence agents rather than law enforcement, sworn to protect the public, it creates this attitude that the public doesn't have a right to know what they're doing. And now that includes even hiding their identities in public. Question: why do you think some officers are masking? He responds, I have not had conversations with current officers, but I imagine some are masking because they don't normally work for ICE or do immigration enforcement, but are now being sent to do these jobs. They also want to stop it here real quick. They don't want to be accountable. That's why they pull their names off too, so they can do whatever they want. They want to kick somebody in the face. I'm going to kick somebody in the face. Huh? They want to just walk up and punch the shit out of somebody. I'll do it. But hey, who's going to tell on me? They don't even have my name. I got a mask on. I do whatever I want. That's what it's all about, I think. Um, Moving on. He goes on, the Trump administration has diverted some federal officers from agencies like the FBI, Drug Enforcement Administration, and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, the ATF, to support ICE raids, reportedly pushing agents who would be tackling violent crimes to instead handle civil immigration violations. When these officers go home at night, they may not want people in their communities to know it was them. Maybe they have upstanding reputations, okay, because of the work they do for the FBI or ATF, and they don't necessarily want to be identified with this kind of indiscriminate targeting of immigrants. And that reluctance to be identified as engaging in those activities really highlights the illegitimacy of those actions. Question: are these concerns about having masked officers from other agencies working for ICE? He says officers from other federal law enforcement agencies are used to operating within specific authorities, and they may not recognize that ICE enforcement actions don't necessarily allow for those same actions. When an FBI or ATF agent is seeking to arrest someone, they typically have a warrant signed by a judge and can go after that person even on private property. ICE's civil enforcement powers don't give them that authority. If ICE doesn't have a judicial warrant, they can't go into somebody's home. So if the FBI is doing ICE enforcement, they have to understand their authority is limited in important ways in order to not violate the law. That's also why it's critical for agents to identify what agency they're with. Otherwise, it's hard to understand under what authority an action is being taken. Question: who is this person shoving a member of the public who is just asking questions? He says, historically, what are the basic standards in training for law enforcement showing their faces? I'm not aware of any general authority authorizing an agent not to identify themselves during public enforcement activity. As a former FBI undercover agent, I tried to avoid getting my picture taken as much as possible. But it is a small number of individuals who engage in undercover operations who would require any kind of masking, and they have the option of not participating in arrests where they are going to be in public. A lot of training is about police safety. Yeah, okay. And part of that safety is having a clear indication that you are a law enforcement official when you're engaging in some type of activity that could involve the use of force or arrest, including protest management. The badge was intended to protect the officer, to make it clear you're acting under the authority of the law and not just shoving somebody you don't like. But they do it anyway. As an FBI agent, if I was going to talk to a member of the public, I'd identify myself and display my credentials and then do it anyway, right? It was routine. And anytime I would write up the interview for evidentiary purposes, the first thing I'd write was identified myself and let them know the purpose of the interview. Question: do you think lawmakers can address this issue with legislation? He says some Democratic U.S. senators have pushed ICE to require that agents identify themselves, and California lawmakers have introduced state legislation to ban law enforcement from masking on duty, arguing public servants have an obligation to show their faces and not operate like Star Wars stormtroopers. Having clear laws, regulations, and policies that require law enforcement to operate in an accountable fashion is critical. But a lot of this is about leadership. Law enforcement leaders are justifying masking as some dubious security measure instead of ensuring officers act in a professional manner at all times and holding them accountable when they don't. That has been a significant problem over time when police engage in illegal or unconstitutional activity. It's great when federal, state, or local legislators pass laws requiring accountability, but those measures cannot be successful if police aren't expected by their own leaders to abide by those rules. Question: what are the ongoing consequences of officers hiding their faces? He responds: the recent shootings of two Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota by a suspect who allegedly impersonated an officer highlights the danger of police not looking like police. Federal agents wearing masks and casual clothing significantly increases the risk of any citizen dressing up in a way that fools the public into believing they're law enforcement so they can engage in illegal activity. It is a public safety threat, and it's also a threat to the agents and officers themselves because people will not immediately be able to distinguish between who is engaged in legitimate activity or illegitimate activity when violence is occurring in public. What are people supposed to do when they're not sure if an officer is legitimate? The question. That question highlights the box that these tactics put Americans into. When they are not sure, the inclination is to resist, and that resistance is used to justify a greater use of force by the officers. And it creates this cycle that is harmful to people just trying to mind their business. And that can mean that these individuals are not just subject to use of force and very aggressive arrests on civil charges, but they could also face more serious criminal charges. The more illegitimate police act, the more resistance to their activities will result. And if the police doesn't trust officers, it becomes very difficult for them to do their jobs. So basically saying, it all comes down to this. Here's what it all comes down to. You got these guys jumping out of a vehicle, unmarked vehicle, may I say. It's just a regular truck, and they run up and they start grabbing somebody. We don't know who the hell they are. It could be a Mexican cartel for all we know. But then they go, hey, we're cops, we're cops. How do we know? You don't have a badge, you have a mask on, there's no name available, and you're in an unmarked vehicle wearing blue jeans and a sweatshirt with a vest that I could buy on Amazon. But furthermore, these cops violate people's constitutional rights or the law. They commit assault, 242 or 245 in California, and they're not held accountable. Why? Because the chief goes, I don't know who the hell that is. I don't know who that. I don't see no name. So basically, law enforcement is becoming a department or an agency of anarchy, and it's free reign anarchy. They have the right to do it. They're certified anarchists, and we have to shut up and take it until we pass a law that they will unmask and have their name displayed. By the way, California's post policy, police officer standards and training, says that a law enforcement officer in California must be identified by one or two items. I forget if it's one or two, but it does say an officer has to have an identifiable item on them, whether it's like a badge number or nameplate, have to have it But how many LAPD cops do we see? No name. Can't tell what their badge says. And then when you ask for the badge number, they walk away. So, yes, America's law enforcement is becoming an agency of anarchy, and they're certified lawful anarchists because they have a badge. And we can't do anything about it but shut up and take it. Unless we get out our video cameras and we start putting it on social media and getting the news to pick up these stories. Then maybe. But if the California lawmakers have their way, masks are coming down. I see your face. I know who you are. And I'm going to post this all over social media unless you behave.